These racist cops arrest a black man, only to face him in court as the judge. "Get down on the ground. Hands behind your back." The cold metal of handcuffs bit into Marcus Daniels' wrists as he was forced to the pavement, his cheek pressed against the dirty concrete. A group of bystanders gathered, their phones recording, but their voices of protest were drowned out by the harsh orders of the officers. "I didn't do anything," Marcus shouted, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and outrage. He had just left a local diner, his briefcase in hand, on his way home after a long day at the courthouse. But to the two officers, he was just another black man in a nice suit in the wrong part of town. "You fit the description," one officer snarled, yanking him to his feet. The other rifled through his briefcase, scattering his legal documents onto the sidewalk like trash. "Description of what?" Marcus demanded. "Shut up," came the response, laced with venom. Despite his protests and the pleading from witnesses, Marcus was thrown into the back of the police car. His dignity stripped away in front of a crowd, his heart pounded as he realized that this wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about who he was, and who they thought he wasn't. Marcus Daniels grew up in the rough neighborhoods of Atlanta. His mother, a single parent, worked 3 jobs to ensure that Marcus and his younger sister, Tina, had a shot at a better life. Marcus was the first in his family to go to college, graduating magna cum laude from Howard University before attending Harvard Law School. Years of hard work led him to become one of the most respected legal minds in the state. His colleagues admired his brilliance, his community celebrated his success. But none of that mattered in the eyes of officers Brad Carson and Mike Harris, who saw a target, not a person. In their eyes, Marcus was just another black man who didn't belong in their neighborhood. Sitting in the cold holding cell that night, Marcus felt a heavy weight pressing down on his chest, suffocating him in a way he had never experienced before. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed above him, flickering slightly, casting eerie shadows on the cracked concrete walls. The metal bench beneath him was cold and unyielding, a painful reminder that he was no longer in control of his life. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming frustration boiling inside him. He had spent years of his life fighting against the very system that now held him captive, and yet, here he was, powerless, humiliated, and utterly alone. He couldn't stop replaying the moment over and over again in his mind, each detail burning into his memory like a scar. The way the officers had looked at him with smug arrogance, their hands tightening the cuffs as if he were some kind of dangerous animal. The sneering words, dripping with condescension, still echoed in his ears. "What are you doing in this neighborhood, boy?" One officer had spat, his grip tightening unnecessarily as he forced Marcus against the squad car. The humiliation of being shoved down in front of strangers, of feeling the hot stares and hushed murmurs, cut deeper than any physical pain. He had always known that prejudice lingered beneath the surface, but experiencing it firsthand in such a brutal and public way shattered something inside him. He glanced down at his wrinkled suit, now stained from the dirty pavement. His briefcase, once a symbol of his achievements, lay somewhere back on the street, its contents scattered and trampled. Marcus had worked too hard to get to where he was, too many sleepless nights, too many sacrifices, to end up here, sitting behind bars like a common criminal. And yet, no amount of degrees, accomplishments, or accolades had protected him from this moment. The other inmates in the cell cast him curious glances, some with pity, others with quiet amusement. Marcus kept his gaze forward, unwilling to show the turmoil raging inside him. He had defended men in this very situation, stood before judges, and argued for justice. But tonight, justice felt like a distant dream, something reserved for other people, not for him. He thought about his mother and how proud she had been when he graduated law school. Her voice played in his head, gentle yet firm. "Marcus, no matter how high you climb, they'll still see you as they want to see you." But you remember who you are. He clenched his fists, swallowing the lump in his throat. How could he remember who he was when the world insisted on stripping him down to nothing? The hours dragged on, and Marcus found himself staring at the rusted bars, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. Would his career survive this? Would anyone believe him? He knew how the media worked: sensational headlines, biased narratives. One mugshot, and everything he had built could crumble. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. An officer approached the cell, his keys jingling ominously. Marcus looked up, and for a brief moment, hope flickered inside him. Maybe this was a mistake that could be rectified. Maybe someone had realized who he was. But the officer only smirked and said, "Looks like you're spending the night, hotshot. Better get comfortable." As the officer walked away, laughter erupted from the other side of the bars. Marcus leaned his head against the cold wall, closing his eyes. He could feel the rage building inside him, the unfairness of it all gnawing at his soul. He had spent his entire life playing by the rules, believing in the system, and yet, in a single moment, he had been reduced to nothing more than a suspect. The weight of injustice pressed down on him, heavier than the steel of the cuffs that had bruised his wrists. But beneath the anger, beneath the humiliation, a quiet resolve began to take root. They had tried to strip him of his dignity, but they hadn't taken everything. Not yet. The following morning, Marcus was transferred from the holding cell to a small, dimly lit courtroom. His hands were still shackled, the metal digging into his skin as he walked toward the defendant's table. The coldness of the room mirrored the chill that had settled in his bones overnight. He had hoped for a quick resolution, a simple recognition of the mistake, but the reality of the situation settled him like a heavy fog. As he sat down, the weight of being in that chair, the chair that was supposed to belong to the accused, the powerless, crushed him. He had been a judge for years, sitting at that very table many times, but this felt different. This wasn't just a case. This wasn't just a mistake. This was his life, his identity, and everything he had worked for now hanging in the balance. The room was packed with people, lawyers, court officers, and a handful of journalists. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, but not the way they had looked at him in his former role. Now, there was a certain sneer in their gaze, a quiet judgment in the way they whispered among themselves. They didn't know the full story, but it didn't matter. They had already decided who he was, and it wasn't the man who had once stood in front of them, commanding respect. He was just another black man accused of a crime he didn't commit. The door creaked open, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the room as the prosecutor entered. She was young, confident, her face painted with the arrogance of someone who believed her job was done before it had even started. She barely acknowledged Marcus as she set her files on the table, preparing her argument. The defense attorney, an older man with a smug grin, stood up next. He exchanged a few words with the prosecutor, but Marcus wasn't listening. He was too lost in the disorienting spiral of his own thoughts, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. This wasn't just about his arrest. It was about how everything, his career, his reputation, his place in the world, had been shattered in an instant. The charges against him were vague, but they didn't need to be specific. The system had already labeled him. Suspicion of theft, they said. But suspicion wasn't a crime, was it? It wasn't enough to strip someone of their dignity, to ruin their life. Yet, here he was. The prosecutor began her opening statement, speaking with practiced ease, her words sharp as knives. She described Marcus as an arrogant, privileged man who had resisted arrest when officers simply tried to do their job. The words were designed to paint him as a criminal, to turn the facts in her favor. "He may wear a suit, but a suit doesn't change who you are," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Marcus didn't flinch, though every word stung. The familiar weight of the courtroom, the pressure of standing on trial, was nothing compared to the humiliation of being here for something he hadn't done. But still, he sat there, silent. Every word from the prosecutor felt like a blow, but he knew this was just the beginning. His attorney, a young woman with barely enough experience to handle a case of this magnitude, stood up to counter the accusations. She spoke of the inconsistencies in the officers' statements, of the lack of evidence, of Marcus's character and long-standing contributions to the community. But even her words seemed to fall flat against the power of the system, which had already made its decision. Then came the moment that hit Marcus the hardest. The judge, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, called the officers to testify. The two men who had arrested him, Brad Carson and Mike Harris, walked into the courtroom, their heads held high, as if they had nothing to answer for. Marcus's heart sank as he saw them. They wore their uniforms like shields, their smug expressions radiating an unspoken confidence. Brad Carson stepped to the stand first. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself like a man who had been in control his whole life. His voice was steady as he recounted the events of the night before, telling a version of the story where Marcus had been defiant, aggressive, and difficult. He painted Marcus as a dangerous figure, a threat to the officer's safety. He wasn't cooperating, Carson said, his words laced with venom. He resisted, threatened us. I had no choice but to bring him in. Mike Harris, the second officer, added his own testimony, agreeing with everything Carson had said. Their versions of the story aligned perfectly, as if they had rehearsed it. But Marcus wasn't fooled. He knew what they were doing. They were playing their part in a story that had already been written, a story where the black man was always the villain. Marcus clenched his fists under the table, trying to hold on to his composure. The officers were lying, and the court knew it. At least, he hoped they did. The evidence didn't match their claims. There were no bruises, no signs of resistance. But none of that seemed to matter. It was the words that held the power, the words that would forever shape how people saw him. As the trial continued, Marcus felt more and more isolated. He had been in countless courtrooms before, had stood in front of guilty criminals and victims alike, dispensing justice with clarity. But here, in this moment, it felt as if the scales of justice were broken. The system wasn't on his side. His integrity, his reputation, his years of hard work, they didn't count for anything in the face of his skin color. The harsh reality of the situation settled over him. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom, he was fighting for his identity, for the right to be seen as a person, not a stereotype. He was fighting to remind the world that his worth was not defined by the color of his skin, nor the lies that were being told about him. And yet, even as everything seemed to crumble around him, he refused to let go of that sliver of hope. He would not be broken. No matter how much the system tried to tear him down, no matter how many lies they fed to the court, Marcus knew he would fight to the very end. The days after the trial dragged on like a heavy, endless storm. Marcus spent each one in a haze of anger and frustration, but also something deeper, a kind of numbness, as if the emotional pain had worn him down to the point of exhaustion. He had been through hell already, yet it felt like the true battle was only just beginning. The constant barrage of media attention, the whispers of disbelief from colleagues, the disapproving stares from people in his community, everything felt like it was slowly eroding the life he had built. But through it all, there was one thing that kept him going, the knowledge that he couldn't, and wouldn't, let them win. It was a Friday when the phone call came that would change everything. His attorney, the young woman who had fought beside him through the endless court hearings, called him with a piece of good news, albeit one that came wrapped in more uncertainty. "We've filed the lawsuit against the department," she said, her voice tentative but firm. "We have a chance to take this all the way to court. But it's going to get messy. You know how these things go." Messy was an understatement. Marcus had seen the system twist itself into knots to protect its own before, but he had never expected it to come for him, not like this. Still, he knew what he had to do. The officers who had arrested him, Carson and Harris, would answer for their actions. But more than that, the entire system of discrimination and systemic racism that had allowed this to happen needed to be held accountable. The following weeks were a blur of preparation. Marcus found himself reliving every moment of his arrest, every detail he had tried to forget, the harsh lights of the squad car, the roughness of the handcuffs cutting into his skin, the way his breath had caught in his chest as he struggled to understand why this was happening to him. Each memory seemed to deepen the anger, but also something else, a clarity that cut through the fog. He had lived through worse. The system had tried to crush him, but he was still here, still standing. But there was no pretending this was easy. The lawsuit quickly became a public spectacle. The department fought back with everything it had, trying to discredit Marcus at every turn. It wasn't just about them protecting their officers anymore, it was about preserving the status quo. They called him an opportunist, a disgruntled judge trying to gain fame at the expense of two officers who had done their duty. There were moments when Marcus felt the weight of it all threatened to break him. But each time the doubts crept in, he would remember what was at stake, not just for him, but for the countless others who had suffered in silence, the countless people who had been crushed by the weight of a system that had decided their worth before they even had a chance. As the trial date neared, Marcus found himself walking through the halls of his old courthouse again, but it felt nothing like it used to. People who had once admired him now looked at him with either pity or suspicion, and he had to steel himself to face them every day. His colleagues, the ones who had celebrated his achievements, now acted as though they were unsure how to even greet him. He had always been the one they looked up to, the one they turned to for guidance. Now, he felt like a pariah, cut off from the very world that had once embraced him. But amidst the whispers, one voice remained steady, the voice of his mother. Her words came back to him, clearer than ever. "Marcus, no matter what they try to do, you know who you are. They can't take that from you." She had been right. They couldn't take it from him. They could take his reputation, his job, his image, but they couldn't take his heart or his mind. And in that, Marcus found a strength he hadn't known he had. Then came the pivotal moment, the day the case against the officers went to trial. It was a day Marcus had prepared for, but nothing could have prepared him for what it felt like to sit in that courtroom, not as a defendant, but as a plaintiff, no longer the one accused, but the one demanding justice. The officers, Carson and Harris, took the stand again, but this time, they weren't the ones in control. They had no stories to tell that could save them, no lies to weave that would make the truth disappear. The evidence was overwhelming. Surveillance footage, body cam footage, witness statements, they all pointed to the same conclusion. The officers had lied, had deliberately sought to intimidate and arrest Marcus without cause. It was clear that they had thought they could get away with it, that their word would always be taken over his. But now, in the glare of the courtroom, surrounded by the truth, they were unraveling. The defense attorney tried to salvage their case, but there was no saving them. Marcus had been patient, had let the pieces fall into place. The story was finally being told the way it had needed to be from the beginning. The turning point came when Marcus, calm and composed, took the stand. He spoke not with anger, but with quiet dignity. He explained what had happened that night, not as a victim, but as someone who had been forced into a battle he never wanted. He talked about his career, his family, his commitment to justice. And he spoke about the weight of the discrimination he had faced, not just from the officers, but from a system that had never truly seen him as equal. The room fell silent as his words sank in. The jury listened, the judge listened, even the officers on the other side of the courtroom were forced to listen. Marcus didn't just fight for his freedom that day, he fought for every person who had ever been silenced, for every voice that had been ignored, for every black man who had ever been treated as less than human. And in the end, the truth won. Carson and Harris were convicted, their badges stripped away, their careers destroyed. But the victory wasn't just about the officer's punishment. It was about something deeper. Marcus had reclaimed his voice, his dignity, and his place in the world. The fight was far from over, but in that moment, he knew that no matter what, he would continue to stand tall. The system had tried to break him, but it had only made him stronger. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the gavel came down, signaling the end of the trial. Marcus had won, but it didn't feel like victory. The weight of the last few weeks, the struggle, the emotional toll, all of it had settled into him like a heavy, unshakable cloud. He had exposed the corruption, had stood up to the system that had tried to crush him, but the scars were still there. Even with the guilty verdict, there was no moment of pure triumph. The world hadn't suddenly become fair, and his fight wasn't over. In fact, it felt like the beginning of a different kind of battle, a battle to heal, to rebuild, to understand what all of this had cost him. As Marcus walked out of the courthouse, the cameras flashed in his face, the reporters eager to capture his every move. His mind was numb, processing the emotions of the trial, but the constant presence of the media made it hard to focus on anything else. They wanted sound bites, stories of triumph and revenge, but Marcus didn't have any of that to give. He didn't want to be a symbol, didn't want to be the poster child for a cause. He just wanted peace. But peace was elusive. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of press conferences, interviews, and public statements. His attorneys guided him through the media frenzy, but there was only so much they could control. Every time he spoke, it felt like he was saying the same things over and over, explaining the same pain. And still, people didn't understand. They didn't understand how a man who had given everything to the law, who had spent his life serving the public, could be reduced to this. They didn't understand the mental and emotional toll it had taken on him. It wasn't just about winning the lawsuit, it was about the fact that he had to prove he wasn't guilty in the first place. Marcus found himself retreating further and further from the world. The calls, the emails, the pressure to speak out, it all became too much. The only moments of clarity he had were in the quiet of his apartment, where he could sit alone and reflect. But even then, his mind wouldn't stop. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of Carson and Harris, heard the accusations and the lies that had been thrown at him. And beneath it all was the constant hum of doubt, the fear that this victory, this justice, wasn't enough. That it could all be taken away from him again, just as quickly as it had been given. It wasn't until he visited his mother's grave that he began to find the peace he so desperately needed. Standing there in the cool wind, looking at the stone that marked the place where she had been laid to rest, Marcus felt the weight of everything that had happened start to lift, even if only for a moment. She had always been his foundation, his unwavering support. And in that quiet space, he could almost hear her voice again, soft and warm, telling him that he had done the right thing, that he had fought for something bigger than himself. She had known that the fight would never be easy, but she had always believed in him. It was in this moment of solitude that Marcus began to understand something he had never fully grasped before, the need for self-forgiveness. He had spent so long fighting for justice, for recognition, for validation from others, that he had forgotten to acknowledge his own humanity. He had beaten himself up over every mistake, every misstep, and had convinced himself that he wasn't enough, that he didn't deserve to be free of the weight others had placed on him. But standing there in the wind, staring at the grave of the woman who had loved him unconditionally, Marcus realized that he had to forgive himself. The burden of trying to prove something to the world was exhausting. No matter how many victories he achieved, no matter how many wrongs were righted, it would never bring back the time he had lost. And the truth was, he didn't need the approval of anyone else. His worth wasn't measured by the opinions of the media, the public, or even his peers. It had never been. His worth was inherent, it was in his heart, in his strength to rise again after every fall. As Marcus stood there, the breeze tugging at his coat, he allowed himself to feel the weight of everything he had endured, and for the first time, he let it go. He released the anger, the hurt, the resentment that had been building inside him for so long. The officers, the trial, the injustice, they no longer had the power to control his narrative. He had taken back that control. It wasn't long after that Marcus returned to his work, not in the same capacity he had once held, but in a different way. He began working with organizations focused on criminal justice reform, using his experience to shed light on the realities of systemic racism. He didn't do it for recognition or for applause. He did it because it was the right thing to do, because he knew that if he didn't continue to fight, if he didn't use his voice for something greater, then the whole ordeal would have been for nothing. And perhaps, most importantly, he did it because he had learned to accept his own imperfections. The battle with the world had been won, but the real victory came in the quiet acceptance of who he had become. The system that had tried to break him was still there, still deeply entrenched, but Marcus had found a way to move forward. He understood now that his fight wasn't just about winning, it was about changing the world, even in small ways, and making sure that his story was one of redemption, not just pain. In the end, it wasn't about the officers or the trial or the headlines. It was about the quiet, unspoken truth that he had survived, and that, no matter how many battles he would face in the future, no one could ever take away the strength he had found within himself. And no matter how much they tried to tear him down, they could never strip him of his dignity. The world outside had not stopped turning, and Marcus found that despite his personal victory, life around him remained unchanged. It was as if the noise of the past few months, the media frenzy, the legal battles, had faded into the background, replaced by the hum of his daily routine. But in that quiet, something shifted in him. There were still moments when he felt the sting of the past, the bitterness of being judged before he could prove himself, but those moments were growing fewer and fewer. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw someone who had been through a fire and come out not only unscathed but stronger. But the true test was not in the public eye, it was in the silence, in the quiet spaces where the weight of everything he had endured could settle in his bones. Those nights when the world slept, and Marcus would sit by the window, staring into the city that never stopped moving, he could feel the loneliness creep in. The isolation that came with the journey of self-discovery was deeper than anything he had expected. It was not the loneliness of being alone in a room, it was the loneliness of realizing that no one, not even his closest friends, could fully understand what he had been through. They hadn't walked the same path. They hadn't faced the same betrayals, the same injustices. They hadn't had their entire identity called into question, dissected under the harsh glare of the media. Still, Marcus had made a decision. He was going to walk this path on his own terms. The journey to healing, to self-acceptance, was never going to be easy, but it was his. No one could take that away from him. He had learned to trust himself in ways he had never known before. As the months passed, the legal battles faded into the background, replaced by the new battle of living a life of purpose beyond the courtroom. The organizations he had started working with had begun to take on more importance in his life. He no longer just fought for justice for himself, he fought for all those who had been unjustly imprisoned, for the families torn apart by systemic racism. He used his platform to speak out, but always with a sense of purpose, always grounded in the pain and the lessons he had learned. It was a Saturday afternoon when Marcus found himself sitting in a small, modest church. The church wasn't his usual place of solace, it had always felt too constricting, too filled with judgment for him to find peace. But today, something had drawn him in. Perhaps it was the need for a quiet moment of reflection, or maybe it was the invitation from an old friend, someone who had reached out after hearing his story. Marcus hadn't expected to find comfort in a place like this, but sitting there, listening to the soft hum of the choir, he began to understand the power of forgiveness. The preacher spoke not of vengeance, not of anger, but of grace. Of the power to let go of the pain, of the strength it took to forgive those who had wronged you. It was a concept Marcus had heard before, but today, in this moment, it struck him in a way it never had before. The faces of Carson and Harris floated into his mind, not as enemies, but as human beings. They had hurt him, yes. They had tried to destroy his life. But they were not the sum of their actions. They, too, were a product of the system, a product of their own brokenness and fears. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt the heavy burden of resentment begin to lift. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean that the pain he had endured was erased. But it meant that he no longer had to carry the weight of their wrongs with him. He could let it go. After the service, his friend approached him with a warm smile. "You look deep in thought," she said softly, her eyes kind. "Are you okay?" Marcus nodded, though it felt like the word okay wasn't enough to describe what he was feeling. "I think I'm starting to understand something," he said, his voice a bit distant but steady. "It's not about letting them off the hook. It's about freeing myself." His friend smiled knowingly, as though she had heard him say these words before in some form. "It's the hardest thing to do, Marcus," she said, "but it's the only way to move forward. Not for them. For you." The conversation lingered in his mind for the rest of the day, and it was as though the clouds had parted in his heart. The bitterness, the constant barrage of anger he had clung to for so long, was finally beginning to fade. Marcus knew it wasn't an easy fix. It would take time. He would have days when he doubted himself, when he wondered if forgiveness meant weakness, when he questioned whether he was truly letting go. But today, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. He spent the next few weeks continuing his work with the organizations, but something had changed. He found himself speaking not just about the injustice he had faced, but about the transformative power of grace and healing. He began to understand that true power didn't come from the ability to make others pay. It came from the ability to rise above, to choose peace even when the world around him tried to push him back down. The struggle was not over. There were still battles to fight. There would always be those who sought to tear down the progress he had made. But Marcus had discovered something that made him unshakable. It was a deep knowing that nothing and no one could define him but himself. The officers who had tried to ruin him had failed because they had underestimated the one thing they couldn't take away: his heart, his will to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. And so, Marcus found himself in the final chapter of this journey, not one of bitterness or revenge, but of empowerment. The world could keep spinning, the systems could stay broken, but Marcus knew he had found his peace. The frustration of the past had burned away, leaving behind a man who had learned to forgive, who had learned to love himself, and who had learned that real strength lay not in fighting the world, but in overcoming the inner battles. It wasn't the end. But it was the beginning of something much more beautiful. The sun had begun to set, casting a soft golden glow over the city as Marcus stood on the steps of the courthouse once again. This time, there were no cameras flashing, no reporters vying for his attention. The courthouse, once a place of turmoil and pain, had transformed into a symbol of his journey, a place of resolution. He had spent years chasing justice, chasing the right to be seen as more than just a victim. And now, after everything, it felt like he had finally come full circle. He had fought with everything he had, and in return, the world had taken its toll on him. But Marcus had emerged from the chaos, battered but unbroken, with a quiet strength no one could ever take away. The city was alive with the hum of evening activity, people heading home, lost in their own worlds, but Marcus felt a stillness in his heart. It was as though the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The struggle had always been more than just about the system, more than just about fighting against those who had wronged him. The real battle had always been within himself. As he turned to leave, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned slowly, expecting another reporter or someone looking for a soundbite. But standing there, in front of him, was someone he hadn't seen in years, Detective Harris. Marcus froze, the air around him growing thick with tension. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Harris looked different, tired, older, and yet, there was a kind of remorse in his eyes that Marcus hadn't expected. The man who had tried to destroy him, the one who had lied, manipulated, and fought against him every step of the way, was standing before him. "I didn't think you'd come," Marcus said, his voice steady but his heart pounding in his chest. Harris nodded, his eyes downcast. "I wasn't sure I should. I owe you an apology. For everything." Marcus raised an eyebrow, the words unexpected. He had spent so long hating this man, so long wanting to see him brought to justice. But in that moment, he realized that Harris wasn't here to defend himself. He wasn't here to explain away his actions or make excuses. The guilt was written all over his face. "I was part of the system that failed you," Harris continued, his voice low. "I let my own biases, my own brokenness, cloud my judgment. I know it doesn't change what I did, but I need you to know. I'm sorry. For everything." Marcus felt the weight of the apology settle in his chest. It wasn't what he had expected. It wasn't the confrontation he had always dreamed of. But it was real. It was raw. And in that moment, something shifted within him. "You don't need to apologize to me," Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm. "You need to apologize to yourself. Because the only way you can change is if you accept what you've done, and make amends not with me, but with the people you've hurt, the people you've failed." Harris nodded slowly, as if the words were sinking in. "I know. I'm trying. Every day. But it's not easy. It's hard to face what I've become." Marcus looked him in the eye, and for the first time in his life, he felt no anger, no bitterness. There was nothing but understanding. Because he knew the truth, forgiveness wasn't about making the other person pay. It was about freeing yourself. Harris had a long road ahead of him, but that wasn't Marcus's burden to carry anymore. "Don't worry about me," Marcus said quietly, turning to leave. "I've already forgiven you. But you need to forgive yourself." As Marcus walked away, he heard Harris speak again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for showing me the way." Marcus didn't turn back. He didn't need to. He had already learned the most important lesson of all, that true freedom came not from the battles you fought, but from the peace you made within yourself. He had spent so long fighting to prove that he was right, that the world owed him something. But in that moment, he understood that no one, not even those who had wronged him, could ever take away the peace he had found inside. And just as the last rays of the sun disappeared behind the skyline, Marcus smiled. Not because he had won, not because he had gotten the justice he sought, but because he had learned the greatest lesson of all, that peace wasn't something you could take from others. It was something you built from within, and it was the only thing that could never be taken from you. But as he reached the street, about to disappear into the crowd, Marcus felt a strange presence. A man approached, someone unfamiliar yet oddly familiar. As the man came closer, Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The man's face was older, and he had a look of quiet resolve, but his eyes, they were the same eyes, the same unwavering determination that Marcus had once seen in his own reflection. The man stepped forward, extending his hand. "I think we have unfinished business," the man said, his voice low and full of meaning. Marcus took the man's hand, not with hesitation, but with understanding. The man had known him in another time, in another life. He wasn't just someone from the past, he was part of the future. As they shook hands, Marcus understood the twist, the final realization. The battle was never about him fighting for others. It was about recognizing that the fight, the journey, had always been for him. He was the key to his own freedom, his own peace. He had already won. And as the man's grip tightened, Marcus felt the truth hit him like a tidal wave. This was the beginning of something bigger, something he hadn't fully understood until now. The system, the people, they weren't the enemy. The enemy was within. And until you conquered yourself, the world would never change. With that realization, Marcus smiled one last time, knowing he had already overcome the greatest obstacle of all, himself.